At 15 minutes past noon on April 29, 1975, Armed Forces Radio in Vietnam broadcast a fake weather report. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. This was followed by the playing of Bing Crosby's I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. It was a prearranged signal for U.S. military and civilian personnel to evacuate the American embassy in Saigon in case of emergency. And indeed, an emergency had arrived, for at that moment, units of the North Vietnamese Army were entering the city. A few hours later, the first of 13 helicopters lifted off from the Defense Attaché's office in Saigon, packed with 149 evacuees. Other helicopters followed. The last of them, its departure immortalized in a photograph that became iconic as a lasting symbol of the American evacuation, took off at 5 p.m. the next day. Other evacuations took place later that week all over South Vietnam. Altogether, some 1,300 Americans and 5,500 Vietnamese fled the country as the communist North Vietnamese took over. Despite American hopes, the South Vietnamese government had proved incapable of sustaining itself for more than a few months once American ground troops left the country. The humiliating American departure, plus the culmination of the Watergate scandal that resulted in the resignation of President Richard Nixon the year before, marked a low point in American national morale and self-confidence. The military services themselves fell into disfavor. Today, it is not unusual for complete strangers to thank uniformed military personnel for their service. But in the 1970s, a uniform was more likely to provoke scorn and abuse. Servicemen were reluctant to wear their uniforms in public. In many ways, the 1970s marked a nadir in prestige for both the nation and for the military services, including the Navy. And recognizing that, efforts began almost at once to repair the damage and put the nation and the Navy back on course. In fact, reforms began even as the war was still raging. President Nixon, if he was flawed in other ways, was nevertheless a savvy politician. He recognized that one reason the war in Vietnam was so unpopular was that much of it was fought by reluctant draftees who knew they had to endure 1 year in Southeast Asia before they could go back to the States and normal life. The incentive for many, therefore, was not so much to win the war as it was to stay alive for a year and a day. And there was the fact that the draft itself was inequitably imposed. Young men of means could avoid it by enrolling in college and staying there, or by getting a friendly doctor to certify that they had some physical ailment that would make them exempt. Poor Americans, and especially poor Black Americans, had more limited access to such deferments. So although Blacks made up only 11% of the population, they constituted more than 16% of draftees who were sent to Vietnam. Nixon was less concerned about the inequities of the system than he was about the fact that the draft itself was widely unpopular. He hoped to mute at least some of the opposition to the war, especially on college campuses, by eliminating the draft and relying solely on volunteers. In 1973, with American participation in the war winding down, Nixon announced that he would end the system of compulsory service that had been established back in 1940. So today's all-voluntary military is a product of Nixon's determination to separate an unpopular overseas conflict from civilian consciousness. That not only gave him a freer hand in Vietnam, it liberated future presidents from having to assess public opinion quite so carefully before committing troops overseas. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing is debatable. The Navy was already an all-volunteer force in 1973, though the elimination of the draft affected it too. This was because many of those who received a draft notice during the war chose to join the Navy as a more desirable alternative to serving in the jungles of Vietnam. That allowed the Navy to cherry-pick the candidates with the highest scores on the Armed Forces Qualification Test. And those individuals tended to be better educated, middle class, and white. Consequently, while the Army was more than 16% black, the Navy was 95% white. After 1973, the number of African Americans in the Navy increased from 5% to 7%. It did not immediately change Navy culture, however. African American sailors continued to confront barriers that limited their service options, and they often encountered abuse from some of their shipmates. All this took place during civil rights protests at home. Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act in July of 1964, only 1 month before it passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that triggered the Vietnam War. That meant that the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement were congruent events. They were connected in other ways too. Older, more conservative Americans tended to support the war, seeing it as simple patriotism, and they tended to regard the civil rights protests skeptically. Younger citizens, on the other hand, and especially college students, protested against the war and for civil rights, often noisily. These circumstances occasionally led to open clashes, not only on college campuses and city streets, but also on board warships of the U.S. Navy. The USS Kitty Hawk was an 80,000-ton supercarrier named for the beach where Wilbur and Orville Wright had first demonstrated the feasibility of manned flight. Launched in 1960, she served on Yankee Station during the Vietnam War, and in 1972 she was participating in the bombing mission known as Linebacker 2. Racial tensions on the Kitty Hawk had been precarious for some time, and they got worse after a fight ashore between white and black sailors on leave in the Philippines. On October 12, 1972, 3 black sailors on the Kitty Hawk's flight deck were stopped by 2 white Marines who told them that black sailors were not allowed to walk in groups of more than 2. Though where such a requirement might have originated is disputed. When the black sailors ignored them, the Marines grabbed one of them and put him in a chokehold. That same day, an 18-year-old black sailor in the chow line asked the white cook for 2 sandwiches. Told he could have only one, he took a second one anyway. That provoked a shouting match with pushing and shoving between white and black sailors. These incidents led some black sailors to mount a protest. Some armed themselves with broom handles and other implements. That night, there was brutal fighting between groups of black and white sailors in the passageways and the berthing decks. 40 whites and 6 blacks were injured. It might have been worse, but for the intervention of the Kitty Hawk's executive officer, who was himself half black and who managed to calm the situation. A subsequent investigation put blame for the violence squarely on the protesting blacks who were described in the report as thugs who should never have been allowed to enlist. The report also insisted that the disgruntled sailors had no grounds for their protest because, to quote the report, there were no instances of institutional discrimination on the Kitty Hawk. One problem was, and is, that institutional discrimination is often visible only to those who experience it. Reading the report today, it is hard not to conclude that many of the senior white officers who wrote it were unable to perceive or imagine the impact on black sailors of the scores of small daily insults they had to endure. And the Kitty Hawk incident was not a one-time event. Later that same year, a rumor circulated on the aircraft carrier Constellation that her captain planned to discharge 250 black sailors from the Navy in order to get them off his ship, and that they were all going to get less than honorable discharges. Once again, whites and blacks fought one another. A white cook had his jaw broken. Afterward, a group of about 50 black sailors staged a sit-in on the mess deck. To avoid a confrontation, the skipper of the Constellation announced over the ship's public address system, the 1MC, that blacks were to report to the fantail and Marines to the forecastle at opposite ends of the ship. One can imagine the confusion this caused for black Marines. When the Constellation returned to port, 120 black sailors, including all of those who had participated in the sit-in, were brought up before Captain's Mast, which was a judicial tribunal used for a wide range of offenses. Of the 120 men charged, 35 were exonerated and received honorable discharges. The rest received various forms of punishment, from loss of pay to reduction in rank, and all of them left the Navy. Collectively, these events and others like them demonstrated that the civil rights protests that were taking place in several American cities at the same time had a naval counterpart. Something had to be done. The man who played the most important role in addressing the problem was Admiral Elmo R. Zumwalt, universally known as Bud. Zumwalt had been the commander of naval forces in Vietnam during the last 2 years of the war. He presided over both the important naval campaigns of the war, Market Time and Game Warden, and he had initiated the Sea Lords campaign in the Mekong Delta. He had approved the use of Agent Orange to defoliate the forest canopy that the Viet Cong were using to hide from American aircraft, long before it was known that the dioxins in the compound caused serious long-term health problems, including cancer. Many of the Americans subjected to Agent Orange subsequently came down with a variety of illnesses. One of them was the Admiral's son, Lieutenant Elmo Zumwalt III, a 23-year-old patrol boat commander. After the war, he developed 2 cancers, Hodgkin's disease and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and died at the age of 42. All that was in the future, however, when Nixon appointed the 49-year-old Zumwalt to be Chief of Naval Operations, elevating him over the heads of many more senior admirals. Nixon's hope was that the handsome, popular, and articulate Zumwalt could restore professionalism and discipline in the Navy while still meeting the concerns of black sailors. Zumwalt met personally with groups of sailors, and he issued the first of what became a long string of all-Navy messages known as Z-grams, more than 100 of them altogether. Some dealt with mundane subjects, such as allowing sailors to grow sideburns and beards and establishing a more liberal liberty policy. Others addressed more weighty issues, such as racial discrimination and the role of women in the Navy. Zumwalt said he wanted to restore the fun and zest, as he put it, of going to sea. He vowed to get rid of what he called Mickey Mouse regulations that served no purpose, and he publicly acknowledged the depth of feeling among black sailors about racial discrimination in the Navy. As but one example, he ordered that black Navy families be allowed access to Navy housing ashore, which had not previously been the case. He also asserted that women should be allowed to serve aboard ships. As a result of these and other initiatives, Zumwalt became a lightning rod between traditionalists and reformers. Longtime Navy veterans grumbled that all this constituted a loosening of Navy standards. Navy chiefs, in particular, who thought of themselves as the guardians of Navy tradition, disliked the erosion of what they saw as the high standards they had grown up with in the Navy. On the other hand, junior officers and most of the enlisted force welcomed the reforms, which they believed were long overdue and which may well have been necessary in an all-volunteer force. If Zumwalt changed the character of Navy life, both at sea and ashore, the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980 was noteworthy for the effort he made to expand and improve the Navy's fleet of warships. Along with his energetic Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, Reagan set a goal of expanding the Navy to 600 warships. Back during World War II, the U.S. Navy had more than 6,000 warships. During the Vietnam War, it had as many as 900. But after both wars, the Navy was severely cut back, a phenomenon common to virtually all of America's wars. In 1980, when Reagan was elected, there were 528 Navy warships in service. Of course, 12 of those warships were large-deck aircraft carriers that packed a significant punch, and 528 was still more than any other Navy in the world. Yet Reagan and Lehman embarked on a program to expand the Navy to 600 warships as a statement of American maritime supremacy. One element of the expansion was the modernization and recommissioning of 4 gigantic Iowa-class battleships that had been decommissioned in the 1950s. These enormous castles of steel, to use Churchill's phrase, had been designed in 1938 when battleships still constituted the yardstick of naval power. By the time they were commissioned during the Second World War, they had already been superseded by aircraft carriers. They were also expensive to operate. They required a crew of 2,000 sailors and were driven by steam turbines that consumed an astonishing amount of fuel oil, 167 gallons of oil per mile. So in strictly military terms, they were not cost-effective weapons. On the other hand, they were visually awe-inspiring. When a 60,000-ton battleship eased into a port anywhere in the world, it made an immediate impression. Between 1982 and 1988, the Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin were updated with modern weapons, including missile systems, and recommissioned as active warships. The experiment was short-lived, however. They were simply too profligate in terms of manpower and fuel. In less than a decade, they were again retired from service. All 4 remain afloat today as museum ships. The Reagan era also included the introduction of the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. These were huge, as large as a World War I battleship. And to make maximum use of them, they had 2 crews, a blue crew and a gold crew, which changed places after each deployment, so the sub could be nearly continuously at sea. The Reagan-era surge brought the number of Navy warships from 528 to 594, though it never got to 600, which was a somewhat arbitrary goal anyway. Still, by the late 1980s, the U.S. Navy had largely recovered from its post-Vietnam malaise, partly by enlarging and modernizing its ships, but also by modernizing its culture. Another reform of this era that had a profound effect on the Navy as well as the other services was a milestone piece of legislation sponsored by Barry Goldwater and William Nichols and signed into law in 1986. One of the lessons of the Second World War that was reinforced in both Korea and Vietnam was the importance of effective service coordination. The U.S. military is at its best when all the services are pulling in the same direction. Of course, the Navy and Marine Corps were, and still are, part of the Navy Department, which made coordination between those two branches fairly easy, but all too often the services were at loggerheads with one another over priorities, logistics, operational planning, and other issues. The Goldwater-Nichols Act was supposed to fix that. A term that became popular after the passage of this act and is still used today is purple suitor. Purple is the color that you presumably would get if you took navy blue, Army green, and Air Force light blue uniforms and threw them all in the wash together. A purple suitor is someone who serves all the services, not just his or her own. Jointness, to use the modern euphemism, was now mandated by statute. It is based on the assumption that the separate services are part of a singular whole, that the whole can be greater than the sum of the individual parts. There were objections to this new approach from traditionalists. Each service cherished its own history and its own traditions. In discussing joint command during World War II, Churchill once challenged U.S. Army General George Marshall by saying, "What does an Army general know about navigating a ship?" To which Marshall shot back, "Well, what does a Navy officer know about a tank battle?" Churchill eventually gave way on the point, and given the interconnectivity of modern weapons systems, jointness is literally unavoidable. Of course, many traditions of service rivalry still survive. I can assure you personally that plebes at the Naval Academy still shout, "Beat Army," every time they square a corner in Bancroft Hall. Throughout this period of reform and expansion, the Navy remained the tip of the spear of U.S. foreign policy, a fact that was especially evident during several overseas crises in the 1980s. The Soviet Union remained America's principal rival in this period, though the rivalry played out through surrogates rather than in direct confrontations. Any suggestion that the Soviets were trying to get a foothold in a third world country brought close oversight and sometimes intervention by the United States, and the tool of that intervention was almost always the United States Navy. Here's one example. In Central America and the Caribbean, a few small nations toyed with socialism, and several opened friendly ties with Castro's communist government in Cuba. One of these was the tiny island nation of Grenada at the tail end of the Lesser Antilles. In 1980, Grenada signed an agreement with the Soviet Union to allow long-range Russian aircraft to use an airfield there. And when a military junta executed the country's prime minister and took over the government, the ensuing violence and chaos convinced the Reagan administration to intervene. Ostensibly, this was done to ensure the safety of a number of American medical students attending the St. George Medical School on the island. For what was called Operation Urgent Fury, the Navy assembled a 12-ship task force built around the carrier Independence and the amphibious assault ship Guam with 1,900 Marines on board. A Navy SEAL team secured Government House in advance of the landings and held it, despite several attempts by Cuban soldiers to retake it. Helicopters from the Guam brought Marines to the airfield, and the main landing took place near the medical school at the southern end of the island. Despite resistance from the Cuban military detachment, the Marines secured the island quickly, suffering 18 men killed and 116 wounded. The entire operation was well planned and crisply executed. Of course, there were disputes about whether it had been necessary in the first place. While the safety and security of the American medical students was certainly a factor, it was the presence of Cuban soldiers that alarmed the U.S. government. In the 1980s, Cold War considerations trumped almost all other issues. But in addition to the rivalry with the Soviets, a new global threat was emerging, one that would come to dominate U.S. security interests in the next century. It was terrorism. And in the 1980s, it manifested itself in several ways. In the Middle East, resentment of American support for Israel led some Palestinians to target American assets. In September of 1984, a truck bomb exploded outside the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 23 and wounding the U.S. ambassador. A few months later, a group of Palestinians hijacked a TWA airliner and ordered the pilot to fly to Libya. And 4 months after that, other terrorists hijacked a passenger ship, the Akil Loro, off the coast of Egypt and held its passengers hostage for 3 days. The hijackers were captured and imprisoned, but these events were concerning, and several of them seemed to be directed by, or at least supported and applauded by, the government of Libya, which was headed by the mercurial Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi had seized power in Libya in 1969, and in 1977 he turned the country into a socialist state. Fundamentally, however, he was an ambitious nationalist who provoked wars with both Egypt and Chad, and who encouraged, at least, terrorist actions against the West, including the destruction of Pan Am Flight number 103, which exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing all 259 on board. Gaddafi also insisted that the Gulf of Sidra, an indentation of the south coast of the Mediterranean, was an internal body of water to Libya, like the Chesapeake Bay or San Francisco Bay in the U.S. He insisted that any non-Libyan vessel that entered the bay would be destroyed. The line from Benghazi to Tripoli, he declared, was a line of death. The United States and virtually all other nations considered the Gulf of Sidra international waters, and to validate that, the United States occasionally flew planes through it. In August of 1981, 2 U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcat fighters were on patrol there when they were attacked by 2 planes of the Libyan Air Force. The Navy planes shot them both down. Soon afterward, the U.S. Navy cruiser Ticonderoga and 2 destroyers crossed into the Gulf of Sidra, and the Libyans fired missiles toward them from shore. In retaliation, planes from the carrier America attacked and sunk 2 small Libyan warships. An annoyed Gaddafi approved more terrorist acts, including a bombing in a Berlin nightclub where several American servicemen were killed. President Reagan decided that a more aggressive demonstration was needed, and he authorized Operation El Dorado Canyon. In a joint operation, American aircraft carriers attacked Benghazi, while Air Force planes staged out of Britain attacked Tripoli. Navy planes destroyed MiG fighters on the ground and several Libyan missile sites. Simultaneously, Air Force F-111 bombers struck Libyan bases in Tripoli. The military value of these strikes was modest, but they demonstrated that there were limits to what the United States would tolerate from the sponsors of terrorism. It was a lesson that had to be taught more than once.